Rabindranath Tagore started his creative expression through paint and brush, ink and pen in the evening of his life. He called painting his infatuation. Tagore believed in art, man reveals himself and not his objects. In the planning of the symposium, we knew that it was critically important to have a segment focusing on the vast collection of painting and drawings, as this area of Tagore's work is gaining public interest. Tagore's artworks are truly original, but have not yet been fully studied and analyzed. Unfortunately, we found the perfect person to talk about Tagore's artworks, Raman Siva Kumar, professor of art history at Visva-Bharati, is totally devoted to the study of Tagore's artworks. He is the curator of the exhibition of Tagore's works that will be traveling to Paris, Berlin, Chicago, New York, and maybe Washington, D.C. I am honored to introduce Dr. Raman Siva Kumar, who will talk about paintings of Rabindranath Tagore, a perspective. Dr. Raman Siva Kumar.
Well, today I shall be talking more about Rabindranath's own paintings. There's so much to discuss about it and various ways of discussing it. What I will try to do is to suggest a few entries into it rather than really trying to give you a whole kind of overview of it, but a certain small perspective, maybe a couple of ways of entering his work. Just to recapitulate some of the ideas that we talked about, the basic, that he started painting at the age of 63. Initially through doodles, then 4 years later he started doing independent paintings, and in the 14 years that followed he did about 2,500 pictures, and these paintings actually transformed Indian art. How did it transform Indian art? It brought imagination, it put imagination before skills. It taught artists to look forward and innovate. These were not styles that other artists would follow, but examples that other artists would follow. The process, as we noticed yesterday, began with the doodles, and we look at a couple of them. These are from the 1924 manuscript that we were looking at yesterday, 2 other pages. And you can notice that they have different kind of expressive or rhythmic qualities. And Rabindranath himself drew attention to these aspects when he first exhibited them. And to a certain extent, they benefited from his experience as a writer. On the one hand, his writing had a visual quality to it. It was not just, putting words together, but it had a visual quality and a kind of graphic charm. The other was, he was a master of making words move in different rhythmic progressions. He called these two his unconscious training in drawing. He also confessed, as Deda just had this quote before in the last presentation, that while he was, as a writer, he moved from idea to form, as a painter, he moved from form to idea. And also that his images came to him and he didn't seek them. Of course, I mean, it should be noted, like there is a kind of a group of people who would believe that he was a greater artist as a painter, a greater creative person as a painter than a writer. Of course, I don't share that fully. I mean, he was an important artist. He unraveled other areas of creativity through his painting, but not necessarily to be compared with his writing. As a writer, he was, if one might use an analogy, like a well-armed, well-trained, and highly skilled hunter who could chase what he wanted, pin it down easily, and communicate whatever he wanted. But as a painter, he was more like an angler. I mean, waiting with his rod. But he was a very lucky and rather kind of thoughtful angler who, if something hooked, then he would not let it go. He always had his catch. So, both as a writer and as a painter, he actually were differently skilled. He attempts to, I mention this because there was also this idea which was brought in earlier, that his paintings were essentially expressions of an unconscious kind, unlike the writings. Rabindranath's reaction to that was quoted by Udayda. He didn't totally say no, but he was very ambivalent to this idea. So was it all true that this was a product of the unconscious as such? I'd like to present the argument that it was not entirely the product of a product of the unconscious. One of the reasons is that very often you find that he's trying to explore a particular theme in more than one work. If it was totally automatic, this would not happen. I'm just presenting variations upon a theme. And these are from very early in his career. That similar ideas, similar images, which he tries to do. And occasionally one can even find that what came to him as a doodle, he tries to rework as a painting. Of course, one can also argue that this idea of this habit of repeating or repeated exploration of a theme can be read as a sign of some kind of an obsession. Now here we have to notice that he doesn't revisit themes obsessively at all, although you have a few examples. It's not very often that he goes back to these things, and he always, if he revisits, which are few and rare, if he revisits, then he always tries to do that with some kind of an innovation, a shift. And also we would notice that there are images which are definitely based on observation, which also points to conscious expression in art. Almost portrait-like representations of people he saw. Now these are slightly later images, of course. You should have been noticing things during his travels to various places or through images that he saw in books of a camel with riders, or almost somebody should have posed for this it looks like a drawing done from a figure. And we know that sometimes, at least Rani Chandra says that he drew from people. But in the end, they might not exactly look like the people he drew from. But in this case, one can almost imagine that this was a drawing done from a model. Or here, when he's trying to capture in his own way a kind of chiaroscuro. Or this one. There were also other issues when he first exhibited his works, especially in Germany. His works were compared with the Expressionists and therefore considered a part of the European tradition of modernism rather than a part of the Indian kind of thing. Now, he does share certain things with the modernist attitude in general. And these are some of the aspects that the modernists of his time, they are not always, things that he has himself articulated very consciously, but generally modernists of that time shared that every art form should have an aesthetic autonomy, that each art form should be limited to its natural domain. Painting, for instance, the domain of the visual and the perceptual. Of course, since painting has to limit itself to the domain of the visual and the perceptual, it in some way has to do away with narration, which a lot of European art from the Renaissance onwards did. And painting has to somehow condense itself into an iconic image of something, or into a dramatic moment. Now, these were some of the aspects that we also notice in Rabindranath's painting. Some of the critics gave this name at that time significant form for this whole process. It also, at this point, made a lot of painting more evocative, ambivalent, enigmatic, and so on. These are things that we notice, or people tend to use. These are the words they tend to use when they describe Rabindranath. We can also notice or apply these same words to, say, for instance, certain blue or pink period Picassos. So you can see there was a certain kind of shared modernism at that point of time. The enigmatic character of Rabindranath's images partly came from such an idea of modernism. It also comes to a certain extent from his reluctance to name his paintings, leave them open-ended. Leave them as pure visual statements. He always thought painting was like nature. And by refusing, even when his friends asked him to add an explanation. So we have a number of paintings that show these qualities. It could be a portrait, it could be even a single figure, because part of the enigma, part of the thing, the mystery is because we are all we don't have a clue, and we are trying to find an explanation. The story is half told. A kind of couch and a figure, but the piece of furniture coming alive like some strange creature. Even the drapery takes on an animation. But we are left there hanging, even the space seems to be ambivalent. Or in this case, or even if it's a single figure. So there's so much different ways of handling this. Now, although a writer, like other modern artists, Rabindranath tried to keep his paintings separate from his literary output. And in his pictures, he condensed narration into very poignant, dramatic moments. Now, this is something that many modern artists did. If you look at their work, unlike the artists of the Renaissance and later, where they were always telling stories which, everyone around them knew, the modern artist began to kind of bring in stories which others probably did not know, and they didn't elaborate it. They condensed their images, and the literary was kept out. But at the same time, there was a method. Very often, through a series of images, narration would be reintroduced into the visual. And they had a certain strategy of going about it. Rabindranath had this strategy, or as I said earlier, of not naming his pictures. The viewers are compelled to look at them independently, without the help of the artist, and try to make sense of it on the basis of their sensibility and probably their experience. So you take nothing else but your sensibility and your experience while viewing the pictures. So these condensed narrative moments, we do not know, but obviously they are very interesting possible narrative moments. Almost like a still from a film, or like people probably waiting somewhere. Sound, like as we are seeing things through a glass wall. Sound is cut off. Occasionally, of course, he was also a theater person. So the element of theater comes in. And he possibly, sometimes you have it in his own theater, but he also probably saw expressionist theater during his travels. And there is a kind of, even though there is no, like for instance, Picasso again, if you take, because he's quite a popular artist, something like his Minato series, individual paintings, no particular story narrated, but there's a whole series of images. We can build a narrative probably on the strength of those images. Rabindranath probably does through his images, the placement of these images. If you go through all of these images of men and women in his pictures, probably they seem to be narrating different relations, different emotional kind of positionings. So while he doesn't name the pictures, he leaves you to read them with the strength of your own sensibilities. There are various narrative possibilities involved. So this is what various modern artists did. They reintroduced the narrative impulse through a thematic series. We notice that on the one hand, he was condensing things into an iconic image. On the other hand, he was expanding it through the situational and the gestural into the dramatic. His experiences of the theater should have contributed to this. I mean, the gesture becomes quite important in these images, just like in some of the ones which we saw earlier, the gestures were kind of, reduced, minimalized. Here, on the other hand, is expanding. It's through these gestures these relationships are built up. And various possibilities seem to be emerging. But not something that we can all suddenly recognize and say, okay, this is this, but something that we are compelled to do when we look at the picture. Imagine. They are not, maybe the same viewer would go back to the picture and each time imagine a different kind of narrative possibility. A kind of montage of images, just like in the film yesterday, probably a sequence of images of different kinds of lovers, and all that kind of thing. So you could imagine these as in similar ways. Sometimes they're very theatrical, almost, a scene of judgment probably here. So these keep growing. And as he kept painting more and more, these developed further and further. Now the other thing I would like to kind of point out to you, as a writer of fiction and plays, Rabindranath was observant of human life and was prone to see men and even animals as characters. Any writer, I suppose, this is something that a writer, and especially a writer of short stories like his, would be doing. And about 1/3 of the works he did were images of the human face. And if you look at them, the earlier ones were more like mask, the later ones a little more like portrait, but generally they kind of hover between the two, the idea of the mask and the portrait, hover between the imagined and the real, between the collective social and the particular. And this necessarily need not be just human beings, but even these creatures or animals, birds that he painted. They not only have an animation, but also a sense of character. A bird hurrying somewhere, or two animals, we can't probably even name them probably accurately, but definitely into a kind of conversation. Or a composite animal, perhaps. A bird, flower, human, dancer, all fused into one. Or it could be figures. And I'm deliberately avoiding those veiled faces of women, which they all thought, were his sister-in-law's face, he remembered. And then at some point, if you read some of the earlier text, it almost looks like he painted only one face. So I'm just putting that aside and showing you all the other kinds of faces that he painted. And each is a different character. Some, of course, could have come from his own plays. You see, these are people probably not of the same kind, but people around. And when you begin to paint or even look at painting, we begin to see things more clearly. The other day I was at the National Gallery and I'm looking at all the portraits, and as I'm moving from one room to the other for a time, I began to see the faces of people around more clearly. I began to notice the big differences of faces. So when you become a painter, you also, or when you even engage yourself with painting, you also begin to notice the visual world more intimately with greater focus. And this was happening to Rabindranath. These faces, full of experience sometimes. I mean, not looked at from outside merely. Almost like Walker Evans' photographs. Or when it does something like a mask, the way the sensuality brings into each face is different. One can almost imagine the body of this person. I mean, of course, you can imagine the kind of fleshiness of his face. You can begin from them, construct in your mind the whole person. Very different to the one which you saw before. Or this. You can see they are, I mean, very intensely studied characters. Each one different from the other. And it's almost, I mean, the writer of short stories that we know of. I mean, you can put it alongside. I mean, also the writer of Kapchada. I mean, it's there. I mean, all the people that they were around, all different from one another. And of course, this included himself. I mean, his own self-portraits show us how he was not looking at the external, but at the shifting identity. And this attempt to know himself and to unravel himself. He never liked when people made his portraits, the kind of normal verisimilitude that we talk about, the likeness, and if they tried to capture that, he complained. He thought that they were trying to freeze him. And so he preferred people who portrayed him in a less realistic manner. So we have these few portraits. I end with these. A portrait, I mean a self-portrait where almost his face is like a tower of clouds. I mean, gently rising. Or this one, which is a fiery waterfall or a forest fire. Very different from the first in its mood, in its character. Or this, a very phallic head, I mean, surrounded by dark clouds. I mean, a dark halo of dark clouds. Or these, there are a series of these, about 10 of them he did over a photograph of his on the cover page of Visva-Bharati News, transforming his own photographic image. And each one is a slightly different image. Some look like Shakespearean clowns or fools. And in some, he also turns him into a woman. And where it's completely, I mean, remote, and there is a female face. So it is this play, this transformations of image, taking something, then transforming it into another, looking intensely and imagining alongside. This is probably what he was trying to do as a painter. I end here. Thank you. Rama, Rashi, Rashi, Rashi,